Good morning! I am WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to part 2 of chapter 1 of A Brave New Galaxy. Robert stood in an empty conference room, looking out the large window that made up one of the walls. All of the walls of this particular conference room were windows, but this wall overlooked the shipyard, while the others simply looked out into the office area. Out in the slip, small robots crawled over the frame that was starting to be built. This was a new ship of a new class, and was the first step in a bold new idea by the New Earth government. This ship would be used as a privately owned corporate freighter. A new company was in the process of being officially formed, and they were footing the bill. Though Robert remembered that the New Earth government was only charging them cost to build the ship. There was no profit to be gained. With the facilities he had, which made up the entirety of the New Earth shipbuilding capabilities, his men could do the equivalent of 100 tons in a month. Now, some months, like the ones where they were just bolting on hull pieces, his men could do quite a bit more than 100 tons. But those months were balanced by the months where they had to set the robots aside and hook up the systems themselves. And in those months, they could do less than 100 tons. This particular project would tie up the facility for just under 3 years. But when they were finished, the first private company would have a toehold into space. The idea was to promote growth or some such. If Robert remembered correctly, the idea was that this ship would service future mining companies that would set up shop on planets or moons or asteroids or comets or something. Or at least the ones that were allowed to them, i.e., planets the New Earth government did not want to settle for whatever reason. And as they mined and became rich, New Earth would tax them at pickup, in transit, and at delivery. This ship might be a sign of the future that outstripped any that came before it, at least since the massive arcs hung above the original Earth ready to depart. The symbol might even be stronger than the sight of the rim of New Earth swelling below the shipyard as the shipyard's orbit brought it past the terminus that marked the edge of day and night. And here Robert was, the chief builder of the damned thing. Eventually, Robert turned his back on the site and walked out of the conference room. He had spent enough time there. There was paperwork to do, and meetings to be had. Hans Gottschalk was glad to finally escape the chambers. The din of over 500 people trying to get things done, and every minute of every day could get to you. And that was only counting the representatives. There were closer to 2,000 people, if you counted the various aides and staffers that would hustle and bustle about. Now, it's not that every representative was limited to a 3-person staff, but generally they'd only have a couple of them at most coming and or going from the chambers. On the docket today were discussions over colonization of other moons and planets. Even though the colony of New Luna was only 2 months old by this point, it was a success. They were beating every goal set for them, and were reaching 6-month goals in less than 2 months. And on top of that, due to the resources on this moon, and the mining and refining and the beginnings of industry that were already being formed, the taxes from Luna were nothing to sneeze at. So it was brought up that the NEG should start more colonies on resource-rich planets and moons almost as fast as the Navy could find places that would be conducive to humanity's needs. There were 37 bodies in the new Sol system alone that could be targets. Well, the 37 counted New Earth and New Luna, but still. And that didn't even count the Tesla belt at the edge of the system. And that was before even leaving the new Sol system. Who knew what was out there past this system? Hans was part of a faction that was pro-colonization of any and all bodies that could be colonized easily. There's a bit over 500 million humans in this galaxy, and 99.8% of them lived and worked on New Earth. And the other 0.2% lived on the moon most closely orbiting New Earth. The human race, at least as it was thought of now, in this galaxy, was one major disaster from becoming extinct. Not to mention, with all the planets and moons that they had found life on, sentient life must be right around the corner. Maybe even in the next star system over. The actual vote on colonization was a few days away yet, but everyone was trying to wrangle votes for their sides, including Hans. He had a meeting in about half an hour with one of the representatives that was on the fence to convince him that colonization was the way to go. Representative Talia Coelho was pissed. The vote on going forward with the expensive and massive colonization had been held and tallied a couple hours before. The yes vote won with overwhelming support. It wasn't that Talia was against colonization or that she was fiscally conservative or anything like that. She just thought they were being damned foolish about it. Sure, the one colony humans had was so far wildly successful, but there were a few things these other representatives were not taking into account. The first thing being forgotten was how long the colony had existed. 2 months is not a long enough time for a real viability study. So much could go wrong yet, and everybody was ignoring that. Sure, it was super successful for those 2 months, but there could be colony-ending problems that had already formed and just hadn't had time to start showing yet. If it was up to her, they would wait at least a year before starting a new colony. The second thing was distance. Luna orbited New Earth at 70,000 kilometers. But at its closest, New Mars was 150 million kilometers. And Enyo, one of New Jupiter's moons, was 2,250,000,000 kilometers at its closest approach. From the surface of New Earth, you could look up and see the settlements on Luna with your bare eyes. With a commercially available telescope, you could make out individual buildings. They were so close that if anything happened, the entire fleet of New Earth ships could be to the settlements in a matter of minutes. In fact, it took longer for the ships to navigate the atmospheres of either New Earth or New Luna than it took to traverse the space between those two. For New Mars and Enyo, it would take weeks of travel just to get there. If there was a disaster at either of those colonies, there was very little that New Earth could do in its current state. But her reasons and arguments didn't seem to sway anyone, and another 2 million people were being signed up to leave their homes and colonize a new world. Humanity was expanding once again and pushing out its boundaries. So Talia sat and hoped. She hoped the colonies would be fine. She hoped she would never have a reason to stand in front of the assembly and in a tearful speech remind the assembly she told them so. There were 506 representatives in the assembly, 505 from New Earth and 1 from Luna Colony. And less than 50 of them had voted against colonization. This vote would probably go down as one of the most united votes in New Earth history. This was a new age of exploration, and Talia was powerless to temper the mad dash and that scared her. Each new colony was 1,000,000 people who were being plopped down in a new world they knew almost nothing about. Hell, the new Mars colony was considering itself lucky because someone had thrown together a quick primer on the flora and fauna of New Mars based on the reports of some naval lieutenant who had apparently spent 2 whole weeks on the planet back in January. That was their most valuable resource. A primer based on a very small area that was built over 2 weeks. Thank you for listening to A Brave New Galaxy, Part 2, Chapter 1. And remember, tune in tomorrow for the next installment of Sun Tzu's The Art of War.